Montana Territory, 1876. The unforgiving wind swept across the plains like Judgment Day, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Dust devils danced between the weathered buildings of Silvercreek, a town perched on the edge of civilization where only the stubborn or the desperate made their home. Among them was Dillon Gentry, who believed with absolute certainty that a man carrying secrets had no business seeking happiness. At 25, Dillon had already lived several lifetimes worth of hardship. His lean frame carried muscle earned from years of breaking horses and driving cattle, his hands calloused from rope burns and rains. The shadow cast by his wide-brimmed hat couldn't hide eyes the color of storm clouds, eyes that had seen too much death on the frontier and held their own counsel. His face, handsome despite the thin scar along his jawline, remained clean-shaven by habit, a remnant of his mother's instruction before consumption had taken her 3 years prior. "Cattle don't care if a man's heart is broken," Dillon muttered to himself as he guided his horse, a temperamental buckskin named Chance, down Silvercreek's main street. The town had sprung up like a weed, unplanned but persistent, around a silver strike that had played out too quickly. Now it survived on ranching, a stagecoach stop, and the stubborn resilience of those who refused to admit defeat. Dillon had come to believe the frontier was no place for tenderness. Love was a luxury afforded to those in settled places with locked doors and certain futures. Out here, attachment was just another way to get hurt when disease, outlaws, or the elements inevitably took what you cared for. Better to rely on no one to keep moving, to expect nothing. It was the creed that had kept him alive since his family's homestead burned 5 years ago, leaving him the sole survivor. What Dillon wanted was simple: to earn enough at the Broken Spur Ranch to buy his own small spread, to answer to no man, to create something that was his alone. What he needed, though he would never admit it, was to believe that not everything he touched would turn to ash. The sound of the arriving stagecoach broke his reverie. Silvercreek received the eastbound coach only twice monthly, and its arrival always stirred the town like a stick in an anthill. Dillon wouldn't have paid it much mind except that he'd been tasked with delivering a message to the driver about a cattle shipment. He stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, watching dispassionately as the dust-covered coach lurched to a stop. The door swung open, and Dillon expected the usual assortment of drummers, land speculators, or the occasional widowed aunt coming west to live with relations. What emerged instead stopped his breath mid-inhale. She stepped down from the stagecoach with remarkable grace despite the journey's obvious toll. Dillon guessed her to be no more than 20, though something in her eyes suggested wisdom beyond those years. Her hair, the rich brown of fertile soil with golden strands that caught the sunlight, had been pinned up but was coming loose in soft tendrils around a face that made his heart perform an unfamiliar stutter. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue, modest but well-made, now creased and dusty from the long journey. What struck him most wasn't her undeniable beauty, but the determined set of her jaw as she surveyed the crude frontier town. No one stepped forward to greet her. The woman consulted a small piece of paper in her gloved hand, then spoke to the driver who shrugged apologetically while unloading her trunk, a single, modest piece of luggage that seemed insufficient for someone who appeared to be planning to stay. "Miss, you said the Sullivan place," the driver asked loudly enough for Dillon to overhear. "Yes, Noah Sullivan." "I was assured he would be expecting me," she replied, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent Dillon couldn't quite place. The driver shook his head. "Old Sullivan's been dead 3 months, miss." "Influenza." The color drained from her face, but she maintained her composure with admirable discipline. "I see. Is there perhaps a hotel where I might—" "Widow Jenkins takes boarders," the driver offered, 2 doors down from the mercantile. "Can't miss it." Dillon found himself moving forward before he'd made any conscious decision to do so. "I can show you the way, ma'am," he said, removing his hat and holding it respectfully. "And help with your trunk." She turned, and her eyes, a startling shade of green, like spring leaves against dark soil, assessed him with surprising shrewdness. "That's very kind, Mr. Gentry. Dillon Gentry." "Nora Sullivan," she replied, extending her hand. Dillon froze. Sullivan, you're kin to old Noah. Her chin lifted slightly. I was to be his bride. We had been corresponding for 8 months. The whispers started immediately among the townspeople, who had gathered to watch the stagecoach arrival. Dillon heard fragments, "Maylord her bride and poor thing, and old enough to be her grandfather." Nora Sullivan's spine straightened even more, if such a thing were possible. "If you would be so kind as to direct me to this Widow Jenkins, I would be most grateful, Mr. Gentry." The way she said his name, formal and proper, made Dillon acutely aware of the trail dust on his clothes and the worn edges of his hat. But something in her dignity, in the way she faced adversity without flinching, stirred a protective instinct he'd long suppressed. "Of course, Miss Sullivan." He lifted her trunk with ease, noting how light it was for someone who had presumably left everything behind. "This way." As they walked the short distance to the boarding house, Dillon felt the weight of the town stairs. A mail-order bride whose intended husband had died before her arrival. It was the sort of tragedy that happened all too often on the frontier, where death came sudden and communication traveled slow. "I apologize that no one informed you," Dillon said quietly. "The post is unreliable here." "Life is unreliable everywhere, Mr. Gentry," she replied. "I've learned that lesson well enough." Something in her tone made him glance at her, and he caught a fleeting shadow of old grief in her expression before she composed herself once more. They reached the whitewashed boarding house with its neat front porch and curtained windows. Widow Jenkins, a formidable woman who had outlived 3 husbands, emerged before they'd even reached the steps, drawn by the town's efficient gossip network. "So you're Noah Sullivan's intended," she said without preamble, looking Nora up and down. "Well, come in, child. No sense standing in the street becoming the morning's entertainment." Nora turned to Dillon. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Gentry." He set her trunk on the porch, suddenly reluctant to leave. "What will you do now?" The question escaped before he could stop it. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "I will consider my options," she said carefully. "I am not without skills." Widow Jenkins made a disapproving sound. "Options for a young woman alone in Silvercreek are limited and most not respectable. Noah left that ranch of his to his nephew back east somewhere. Nothing for you there." Dillon watched the information hit Nora like a physical blow, though she betrayed it only by the slight tightening of her fingers on her reticule. "I see," she said quietly. "Then I shall have to create new options." Something about her quiet determination resonated with Dillon. Before he could reconsider, he heard himself say, "The broken spur is looking for a cook." The last one quit when he found gold dust in the creek. It turned out to be fool's gold, but he'd already left. Both women turned to stare at him. "Are you suggesting I become a ranch cook, Mr. Gentry?" Nora asked, her tone unreadable. Dillon shifted uncomfortably. "It's respectable work. Good pay, your own cabin, and time to figure things out." "The broken spur is 15 miles out," Widow Jenkins pointed out. "How's she meant to get there?" "I'm riding back tomorrow." "I could escort her." Something passed between the women, a silent communication that Dillon couldn't decipher. Finally, Widow Jenkins nodded. "You can stay the night here," she told Nora. "We'll sort out what's to be done." Dillon replaced his hat. "I'll call for you at 9 if that suits Miss Sullivan." Nora studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Gentry. I appreciate your kindness to a stranger." As he walked away, Dillon wondered what madness had possessed him. The last thing he needed was to involve himself with a mail-order bride left stranded, especially one whose eyes held secrets as deep as his own. He'd spent years building walls against entanglement, against caring too deeply for anyone who could be taken away. Yet something about Nora Sullivan had breached those defenses before she'd spoken a dozen words. "Fool," he muttered to himself, but he didn't regret his offer. Morning arrived with frost on the ground and Dillon's certainty that he'd made a mistake. A woman like Nora Sullivan, educated and refined despite her circumstances, didn't belong in a rough ranch bunkhouse cooking for cowhands. Yet when he arrived at the boarding house, she was waiting on the porch with her trunk, dressed in a simpler gown of brown wool, her hair neatly braided and pinned. "Good morning, Mr. Gentry," she said, rising from the bench where she'd been sitting. "I trust I haven't kept you waiting." "No, ma'am." He noted the shadows under her eyes and wondered if she'd slept at all. "Are you certain about this? There might be positions in town that would better suit." "I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Gentry," she interrupted, "and I prefer honest labor to charity or pity." He nodded, respecting her pride. "The ranch owner's wife has a gentle mare you can ride. We'll strap your trunk to my pack horse." The journey to the broken spur took most of the day. At first, they rode in silence, the rhythm of the horses' hooves the only sound besides meadowlarks calling from the tall grass. Dillon found himself stealing glances at his companion, noticing how naturally she sat a horse and the way she observed the landscape with genuine interest rather than trepidation. "Have you been in Montana Territory long, Mr. Gentry?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "5 years," he answered. "Before that, Kansas." "And your family?" The question prodded at old wounds. "Gone," he said shortly, then feeling his response too abrupt. "Yours?" A similar shadow passed over her face. "The same." The simple answer contained volumes. Dillon recognized in it the same reluctance to speak of pain that he carried. "What made you decide to become a mail-order bride?" he asked, changing the subject to one he hoped was less fraught, though he immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. Nora was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice was measured. "I was a school teacher in Pennsylvania. When the school closed, I found myself with limited prospects. Mr. Sullivan's advertisement spoke of a small ranch, clean air, and respectful treatment. He wrote beautiful letters." A faint smile touched her lips. "He described Montana sunsets as God's own artwork spread across heaven's canvas." Dillon looked toward the western horizon, where the afternoon sun was beginning its descent. "He wasn't wrong about that." "No," she agreed softly, "though I'm beginning to think he may have embellished other aspects of life here." "The territory isn't kind to those who come unprepared," Dillon acknowledged, "but it rewards grit." "Then we shall see if I possess sufficient grit, Mr. Gentry." There was a hint of humor in her voice that caught him by surprise. They stopped to rest the horses beside a clear stream around midday. Dillon watched as Nora knelt to wash trail dust from her face, noticing the graceful line of her neck and the careful way she preserved her dignity even in such a simple act. "May I ask you something, Mr. Gentry?" she said as they prepared to continue their journey. "Fair's fair," he replied. "Why did you help me?" Her direct gaze challenged him to give an honest answer. Dillon considered several responses before settling on the truth. "Because the frontier takes enough without us letting it take hope too." Something in her expression softened. "That's a rather poetic sentiment from a cowboy." "Don't tell the other hands," he said with the ghost of a smile. "They'd never let me live it down." For the first time he heard her laugh, a genuine sound that transformed her face and sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. They reached the Broken Spur Ranch as the sun was setting. The main house stood solid and welcoming, with lamplight glowing in the windows. Several outbuildings, including a bunkhouse, barn, and a small separate cabin, completed the central compound. In the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling grasslands that stretched to the mountains on the horizon. Martha Wilson, the ranch owner's wife, came out to greet them, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. A woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and laugh lines around her eyes, she assessed Nora with unconcealed curiosity. "So you're the young lady Dillon telegraphed about," she said. "Come inside before you catch your death. October evenings get cold quick out here." Over a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, Martha explained the position. The cook's cabin was small but private, a luxury on a working ranch. Meals would need to be prepared for the ranch hands 3 times daily, with special attention to breakfast and dinner when the men were at the ranch rather than out with the herds. "Can you cook, dear?" Martha asked bluntly. "Yes, ma'am," Nora replied, "though perhaps not in the quantities you require." You'll learn hungry men aren't particular so long as there's plenty of it. Martha studied her thoughtfully. It's not easy work and it's isolated out here. Winter's coming, which means you'll be seeing the same faces day in and out for months. Nora met her gaze steadily. Mrs. Wilson, I came prepared to marry a man I knew only through letters and live on a remote ranch. This position offers me independence and time to consider my future. I am grateful for the opportunity. Martha nodded, apparently satisfied. Dillon, show Miss Sullivan to the cook's cabin. I've had one of the hands light the stove to warm it. The cabin was simple but clean. One room with a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the window, and a chest of drawers. A shelf held a few books left by previous occupants. The wood stove in the corner radiated welcoming heat. The cookhouse is just across the yard, Dillon explained, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. You'll find it stocked with essentials. Martha will show you everything tomorrow. Nora stood in the center of the small space, suddenly looking very young and uncertain despite her composure. Thank you, Mr. Gentry. You've been uncommonly kind to a stranger. We're all strangers until we're not, he replied awkwardly. Good night, Miss Sullivan. As he walked to the bunkhouse, Dillon tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him, a protectiveness he'd forbidden himself to feel for years. Nora Sullivan was not his responsibility. He'd done his Christian duty by helping her find a position. That should be the end of it. But something told him it was only the beginning. The next morning, Dillon watched from the corral, where he was working with a half-broken colt, as Martha introduced Nora to the cookhouse. By midday, the smell of fresh bread and beef stew drifted across the yard, drawing appreciative comments from the ranch hands. New cook's easy on the eyes, remarked Jake Thornton, a wiry cowhand with more charm than sense. Mail-order bride with no groom, seems a waste. Mind your manners, Dillon warned, his voice sharper than intended. She's a lady deserving respect. Jake raised his eyebrows but wisely changed the subject. Over the following weeks, Nora settled into life at the Broken Spur with a determination that impressed even the most skeptical ranch hands. Her cooking improved from adequate to remarkable as she learned to prepare hearty meals that satisfied hungry men after long days of work. She never complained about the early mornings or the sometimes crude manners of the cowhands, though she maintained a quiet dignity that somehow encouraged better behavior in their presence. Dillon found himself inventing reasons to be near the cookhouse, offering to chop extra firewood or carry in supplies from the storehouse. He told himself he was merely looking out for her welfare, ensuring the other men treated her with respect. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He was drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain or resist. They fell into a pattern of brief conversations, moments stolen between his duties and hers. He learned that she had been orphaned at 16 when influenza took both her parents within days of each other. She'd worked as a teacher's assistant before taking on her own classroom at 18. I loved teaching, she confessed one evening as she stood on her cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. The children's faces when they first understand something new, there's nothing quite like it. Why leave it behind? Dillon asked, leaning against the porch rail. A shadow passed over her face. The school board decided a young, unmarried woman was not an appropriate influence on impressionable minds. Her tone made it clear there was more to the story, but Dillon didn't press. Everyone on the frontier carried secrets and sorrows. It was an unwritten rule not to probe too deeply. November brought the first heavy snowfall, blanketing the ranch in hushed white. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures closer to the ranch buildings, and the rhythm of life slowed as daylight hours shortened. With less outdoor work possible, the ranch hands spent more time in the bunkhouse playing cards or in the barn repairing tack. Nora took to leaving books for Dillon, novels and poetry collections she somehow procured through Martha's trips to town. He'd never been much of a reader, but he found himself eagerly devouring the stories, if only to have something to discuss with her when they next spoke. One night, returning the copy of The Last of the Mohicans she'd lent him, Dillon found Nora sitting alone by her cabin stove, a letter crumpled in her lap and tears streaking her face. He nearly retreated, uncomfortable with such naked emotion, but she looked up before he could slip away. "I'm sorry," she said, hastily wiping her eyes. "I didn't hear you knock." "I should come back another time," he offered, already backing toward the door. "No, please," she gestured to the chair opposite hers. "I could use the company if you don't mind." Reluctantly he sat, placing the book on the small table between them. "Bad news." Nora smoothed the crumpled letter. "It's from Noah Sullivan's nephew. He's selling the ranch, he says," her voice caught. "He says Mr. Sullivan mentioned me in his will, left me a small sum as compensation for my trouble. As if my agreement to marry him was some sort of business arrangement. Wasn't it?" The question slipped out before Dillon could stop it. Her eyes flashed. "Is that what you think, that I agreed to marry a stranger simply for financial security?" "I didn't mean, Mr. Sullivan and I wrote to each other for 8 months, Mr. Gentry. We shared thoughts, hopes, fears. I came to care for him through his words, his kindness, his wisdom, his love of this wild country." She gestured toward the window, where moonlight illuminated the snow-covered landscape. "I knew he was older. I knew it might not be a love match as in novels, but I believed we could build something meaningful together." The raw honesty in her voice made Dillon ashamed of his assumption. "I apologize, Miss Sullivan. That was unfair of me." She sighed, the anger draining from her as quickly as it had flared. "No, perhaps it was a fair question. Many women do become mail-order brides out of desperation. I won't pretend I had abundant options." She folded the letter carefully. "But I chose Noah Sullivan because his letters showed a good heart. I thought we might find happiness together, even if it wasn't the passionate love of poetry. And now I have a choice to make. The money isn't much, but it would take me back east if I wished." She looked around the small cabin. "Or perhaps I could find a more permanent place here." "You've come to like it here." Dillon couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. The isolation of ranch life in winter was enough to drive many seasoned settlers to despair. A smile softened her features. "I've found unexpected beauty in this harsh place, the silence after a snowfall. The way the stars seem close enough to touch on clear nights." Her gaze met his. "The honesty of the people. No one here pretends to be something they're not." Dillon looked away, uncomfortable with her assessment. He'd spent years pretending to be less than he was, less feeling, less wounded, less afraid. "Will you tell me about your family someday, Mr. Gentry?" She asked suddenly. "You never speak of them." The question hit like a physical blow. "There's nothing to tell." "I don't believe that." Her voice was gentle but persistent. "No one comes from nothing." "Some stories aren't worth telling," he said, rising abruptly. "I should go, early start tomorrow." She didn't try to stop him, but as he reached the door she said, "Thank you for the company, Dillon." It was the first time she'd used his given name. The sound of it in her voice followed him back to the bunkhouse, where he lay awake long into the night, fighting memories he'd thought safely buried. December arrived with bitter cold and a Christmas celebration that transformed the ranch. Martha Wilson insisted on decorations, a proper feast, and gifts exchanged among the hands. Nora threw herself into the preparations, baking cookies and pies, helping to fashion simple ornaments from pine cones and ribbon for the small pine tree the men brought in. On Christmas Eve, after a dinner that had the ranch hands loosening their belts and praising Nora's cooking with almost embarrassing enthusiasm, Martha produced a fiddle and cajoled one of the older hands into playing. The main house's furniture was pushed back and impromptu dancing began. Dillon stood back, watching as Nora was twirled around by one cowhand after another, her cheeks flushed with exertion and happiness, her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked younger, freer than he'd ever seen her, and something twisted in his chest at the sight. "You're staring like a man dying of thirst watching others drink," Martha said, appearing beside him with 2 cups of her special Christmas punch, liberally spiked with whiskey from her husband's private stock. "Don't know what you're talking about," Dillon muttered, accepting the drink gratefully. Martha snorted. "That girl's brought life back to this place, and to you, though you're too stubborn to admit it." Before he could formulate a denial, the music changed to a slower waltz and Nora broke away from her partner. Her eyes scanned the room until they found Dillon, and she approached with determined steps. "Mr. Gentry," she said, slightly breathless, "would you do me the honor?" Every instinct told him to refuse, to maintain the careful distance he'd cultivated. But something in her eyes, a vulnerability beneath the boldness, made refusal impossible. "I'm not much of a dancer," he warned, setting down his cup. "Neither am I," she confessed, "but it's Christmas." As if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. He took her hand and led her to the center of the room, acutely aware of the eyes watching them. His hand at her waist felt both presumptuous and completely right as they began to move to the music. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly as they turned. "For what?" "For seeing me as more than a pitiful story. For offering me a chance to make my own way." Her sincerity disarmed him. "You've more than earned your place here." "I'm beginning to feel like I belong," she admitted. "I never expected that after." When she didn't continue, Dillon supplied gently, "After Mr. Sullivan died." A shadow crossed her face. "Yes, and after everything else." The music was drawing to a close, but Dillon found himself reluctant to release her. "Nora," he said, using her given name for the first time, "whatever brought you here, I'm glad for it." The admission cost him something, a piece of the armor he'd built around himself. But the way her eyes lit up made the sacrifice worthwhile. "As am I, Dillon," she replied softly. The moment was broken by the ranch owner calling for everyone's attention to offer a Christmas toast. Dillon stepped back, releasing Nora with reluctance, but something had shifted between them. A door opened that neither seemed able to close again. Winter deepened, bringing with it a blizzard that howled around the ranch buildings for 3 days, forcing everyone to stay close to shelter. When it finally cleared, the cattle needed attention, with many stranded in snowdrifts or separated from the herd. Dillon volunteered to check the north pasture, the furthest and most isolated section of the ranch. He set out at dawn, well equipped with extra provisions and blankets in case the weather turned again. What he found was worse than expected. Several cattle had become trapped in a ravine filled with snow, and 2 young steers had already succumbed to cold and exhaustion. Working alone, Dillon managed to free most of the animals, but as afternoon waned, clouds began to gather again on the horizon, warning of another approaching storm. He was leading the last steer to safety when the ground gave way beneath him, a snow-covered washout that sent both man and beast tumbling down a steep embankment. The steer landed badly, breaking its neck in the fall. Dillon fared little better, his leg twisting unnaturally beneath him as he struck the ground. Pain shot through him, white-hot and sickening. When he tried to stand, his leg buckled, and he fell back into the snow with a cry that echoed in the empty landscape. Night was approaching. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and no one knew exactly where he was. Using his knife, Dillon cut strips from his blanket to fashion a crude splint for what he suspected was a broken leg. He managed to crawl to a small copse of trees that offered minimal shelter from the wind, but the exertion left him sweating despite the cold. A dangerous condition he knew could lead to freezing once the sweat cooled on his skin. As darkness fell, bringing with it the first flakes of new snow, Dillon faced the very real possibility that he might not survive the night. The irony didn't escape him. After all his careful avoidance of attachment, he might die alone in the wilderness anyway, with no one to mourn him deeply. No one except perhaps Nora. The thought of her waiting at the ranch, wondering why he hadn't returned, pierced him more sharply than the pain in his leg. In the gathering darkness and cold, Dillon finally admitted to himself what he'd been fighting for months. He had fallen in love with Nora Sullivan, and now he might never get the chance to tell her. Back at the ranch, Nora stood at her cabin window, watching the darkness gather with increasing unease. Dillon should have returned hours ago. The other hands who'd gone out to check cattle had all come back before sunset, bringing reports of difficult conditions but no word of Dillon. When she voiced her concerns to Martha, the older woman tried to reassure her. "Dillon knows what he's doing, probably found shelter at the line shack up north." But something in Martha's eyes told Nora she wasn't as confident as she sounded. He would have taken shelter if he could, Nora agreed. But what if he couldn't? What if he's injured? Martha's husband, John Wilson, overheard the conversation. "Too dangerous to send anyone out now," he said firmly. "Visibility's poor and dropping. We just end up with more men lost." "Then I'll go," Nora said, surprising herself as much as the others. John shook his head emphatically. "Absolutely not. No one's riding out in this weather, least of all you." "But, at first light," he promised. "If he's not back by then, we'll send out search parties." It was a reasonable decision. Nora knew that, but as she returned to her cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that waiting until morning might be too late. The night stretched endlessly. Nora paced her small cabin, alternating between prayers and practicalities. She found herself sorting through her meager possessions, lingering over the few letters from Noah Sullivan that she'd kept. In one, he'd written about the North Pasture, how it was his favorite part of the ranch, with its view of the distant mountains and the creek that ran through it. Something clicked in her mind. Dillon had mentioned checking the North Pasture specifically, and Noah had written that there was a trapper's cabin near the creek, barely standing but still offering shelter in emergencies. Before she could talk herself out of it, Nora was gathering supplies: blankets, bandages, whiskey for pain or warming, food. She dressed in her warmest clothes, layering skirts over wool leggings she'd fashioned after watching the ranch women prepare for winter. Slipping into the stable was easier than expected. The hands were gathered in the bunkhouse, and the night watchman was making rounds at the far end of the property. The gentle mare she usually rode nickered softly as Nora saddled her with hands that shook from both cold and fear. She had never ridden alone at night, let alone in winter. But the moon was occasionally visible through breaks in the clouds, providing just enough light to follow the trail north. Nora had studied John Wilson's crude map of the ranch enough times to have a general idea of the landscape, though everything looked different under snow and moonlight. The journey was harrowing. Twice she nearly turned back as the trail disappeared under snowdrifts, forcing her to guess at the direction. But each time she thought of Dillon alone in the cold and pressed on. After what seemed like hours, she reached the North Pasture. The open expanse of snow-covered ground stretched before her, unmarked except for the tracks of cattle and a single set of horse prints almost filled in by fresh snow. Nora followed the tracks as best she could, calling Dillon's name periodically, her voice swallowed by the vast silence. When the tracks disappeared completely, she felt despair closing in. The North Pasture was huge, and Dillon could be anywhere within it. Then she remembered Noah's letters again, his description of the creek with its distinctive stand of cottonwood trees. In the moonlight, she could just make out dark shapes against the snow in the distance. She turned her horse toward them, praying she wasn't simply following shadows. As she neared the trees, a flicker of movement caught her eye, not human, but the nervous shifting of a horse tied to a low branch. "Dillon's horse, Dillon," she called, her voice cracking with cold and emotion. "Dillon, are you here?" At first there was nothing. Then faintly she heard a response, a weak call that might have been her name. She found him half buried in snow beneath the trees, his face pale in the moonlight, his eyes glazed with pain. His leg was crudely splinted and he was shivering violently. "Nora," he whispered as she dropped to her knees beside him. "Are you real?" "I'm real," she assured him, quickly unpacking the blankets she'd brought. "I'm here to take you home." "How did you find me?" His words slurred slightly, a dangerous sign of advancing hypothermia. "Later," she promised, helping him drink from the flask of whiskey she'd brought. "Right now, we need to get you warm." It took all her strength to help him onto her horse. His own mount was too tall for him to mount with his injury. Somehow, she managed to arrange him in the saddle with her behind him, supporting his weight and keeping him from falling as they began the slow journey back to the ranch. The return took twice as long as her outward journey. Dillon drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling incoherently, sometimes silent for so long that Nora would have to check that he was still breathing. She talked constantly, about the ranch, about books they'd both read, about anything to keep him awake and to stave off her own fear. Dawn was breaking as they finally reached the ranch, where their arrival caused an immediate commotion. Ranch hands rushed to help, carrying Dillon to the main house where Martha had already prepared a bed near the fire. John Wilson's anger at Nora's reckless ride quickly gave way to grudging admiration when he realized she had saved his best hand's life. The ranch's part-time doctor was summoned from town. He confirmed that Dillon's leg was broken, but would heal properly if kept immobilized. More concerning was the frostbite on his hands and face, and the fever that developed as his body warmed. For 3 days, Nora barely left Dillon's side, helping Martha change bandages, coax broth between his lips, and cool his fever with damp cloths. When he was delirious, calling out against unseen threats, she held his hand and spoke softly until he quieted. On the 4th day, his fever broke and he woke properly for the first time, his eyes clear as they found Nora dozing in a chair beside his bed. "You really did come for me," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Nora started awake. "You remember that? I wasn't sure." "Not all of it." He tried to shift position and winced. "But I remember your voice. You kept talking, kept me here when it would have been easier to let go." She moved to help him drink water from a cup, her hand steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Don't talk like that. You're too stubborn to die in a snowdrift." A faint smile touched his lips, says the woman who rode out alone in a blizzard. "I couldn't just leave you out there." The simple truth of it hung between them. Why? His gaze held hers, demanding honesty. Nora hesitated. Since coming to Montana, she'd faced countless challenges with courage, but none as frightening as the question in Dillon's eyes. "Because I've lost too many people I cared about," she said finally. "I couldn't bear to lose you too." Something in his expression softened. "I thought the same thing lying there in the snow, that I'd spent so much time avoiding caring that I might die without ever having told you," he trailed off. "Told me what?" she prompted gently. Before he could answer, Martha bustled into the room with fresh bandages and soup, effectively ending their private conversation. But the question remained in Nora's mind as Dillon recovered over the following weeks, slowly regaining his strength though still confined largely to the main house. They spent hours together during his convalescence, reading, playing chess with a set John Wilson had carved years earlier, talking about everything except the words left unspoken that day. Dillon told her about his family finally, his parents and younger sister who had died when raiders burned their homestead during border troubles in Kansas. How he'd been in town that day and returned to find only ashes and graves to dig. "I decided then that caring for people was too dangerous," he admitted, "that the only safe way to live was to need no one." "And now," Nora asked, he looked at her thoughtfully, "now I'm not so sure. Needing no one nearly got me killed. Caring for someone saved my life." Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the frantic activity of calving season. Dillon was back on his feet, though he walked with a slight limp that the doctor assured would fade with time. Nora continued her duties as cook, but something had changed between them, a tension that was both sweet and unbearable, built of words still unsaid. In late April, a letter arrived for Nora from Noah Sullivan's nephew. He was coming to inspect the ranch before its sale and would arrive within the week. "What will you do when he sells?" Dillon asked as they walked slowly around the ranch yard one evening, his first extended venture outdoors since his injury. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I've saved most of my wages. Perhaps I could find a teaching position somewhere nearby." "Or you could stay." The words seemed to surprise Dillon as much as they did Nora, "as the ranch cook for new owners." "No," he stopped walking, turning to face her. The setting sun cast golden light across his features as he took a deep breath. "As my wife." Nora stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What did you say?" "I'm saying this all wrong." Frustration crossed his face. "I had it planned better. I was going to wait until I had something to offer. I've been saving to buy a small spread of my own. It's not much yet, but with another year's wages." "Dillon," she interrupted gently, "are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," he said simply. "I love you, Nora. I think I have since that first day when you stepped down from the stagecoach looking like you could face anything this territory threw at you." I just didn't want to admit it because loving someone means risking loss. And now I know that not loving is the greater risk. He took her hands in his. I can't promise it will be easy. Building a life here never is. But I can promise to face whatever comes beside you, if you'll have me. Tears blurred Nora's vision. When I came here to marry Noah Sullivan, I thought I was being practical. I believed affection might grow in time, but I never expected. She squeezed his hands. I never expected to find love, real love. Is that a yes? Hope brightened his face. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a hunger that matched her own, months of longing finally expressed. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Nora laughed with pure joy. What? He asked, smiling at her reaction. I came all this way to be a bride, she said, and it seems I will be after all. Noah Sullivan's nephew arrived 3 days later, a thin, serious man with his uncle's eyes but none of his warmth. He expressed surprise at finding Nora still at the ranch, but handed over the small bequest mentioned in his uncle's will without comment. What did surprise him was Dillon's offer to buy the small northern section of the ranch, including the troublesome north pasture and the dilapidated trapper's cabin. That's the least valuable portion, the nephew observed. Difficult terrain, far from town, problematic water rights. It suits me, Dillon replied steadily, and the price is fair. After some negotiation, they reached an agreement. The nephew would sell the main ranch to a cattle company from Wyoming, but Dillon would purchase the northern section, 300 acres of challenging but beautiful land that included the spot where Nora had saved his life. The wedding took place in early June, with wildflowers carpeting the prairie and the mountains still capped with snow. The entire Broken Spur crew attended, along with townspeople from Silvercreek who had come to know and respect Nora during her months in Montana. Martha Wilson had insisted on hosting the ceremony at the ranch before the new owners took possession. Under her direction, the barn was transformed with ribbons and flowers, and Nora wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Martha had secretly ordered from Denver. Every bride deserves something beautiful, she said, brushing aside Nora's thanks. As Nora walked toward Dillon, who stood tall and handsome in a new suit despite his lingering limp, she thought of the journey that had brought her here, the loss and uncertainty, the courage it had taken to travel across the country to marry a stranger. How that journey had led her not to the marriage she'd expected, but to a love deeper than she'd dared imagine. The preacher from town spoke of joining lives, of weathering storms together, words that held special meaning for a couple who had already faced death and survival together. When Dillon slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, purchased with the proceeds from the sale of his beloved horse Chance, his hands were steady and sure. I take you as my wife, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed barn. To cherish and protect, to build a life beside, as long as we both shall live. Nora's voice trembled only slightly as she repeated her own vows. I take you as my husband, to love and support, to face each dawn and dusk beside, as long as we both shall live. Their first home as husband and wife was the rebuilt trapper's cabin, small but solid, with a view of the mountains that took Nora's breath away each morning. Together they worked the difficult land, added a room to the cabin, planted a garden that thrived despite the short growing season. By their first anniversary, the northern pasture boasted a small but growing herd of cattle, and Nora had news that made Dillon's face light with a joy she'd once thought him incapable of feeling. A baby, he whispered, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. You're certain? The doctor confirms it, she said, laughing at his wonder. Expected in winter. He pulled her close, his kiss a promise. You came here to be a bride, became a cook, and now you'll be a mother. What other surprises do you have in store, Nora Gentry? A lifetime of them, I hope, she replied, leaning into the strength and warmth of the man who had helped her find home in this wild, beautiful country. A lifetime of them with you. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that even Noah Sullivan's poetic descriptions couldn't have captured, Dillon and Nora stood together on the porch of their small cabin. The journey that had begun with a mail-order bride stepping off a stagecoach had led them here, to a love as vast and enduring as the Montana sky above them, and a future they would build together, day by day, through all seasons.